Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. That was some testimony from the Todd Kendhammer case, which we do expect live coverage any moment. But before we do, we want to analyze what is the state's case and how strong is it as they begin to close their case and the defense will begin their case. So joining me now from Jacksonville State University is death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, great to see you again on the program.
Hey, good to be with you, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
Great. So I want to talk a little bit about this Todd Kendhammer case. Okay, break it down for our audience in this sense. The state is really putting on a strong case, I think, in terms of why they believe that Mr. Kendhammer murdered his wife and concealed it in a car accident. Can you please list for our audience what you believe are some of the key pieces of evidence that they've put forward about this crime scene that shows that this was a little more sinister and nefarious than Todd Kendhammer originally claimed?
Yeah, Jesse, I think probably for me, the most striking bit of evidence, and as cold as it sounds, is in fact the body, because at the point of death, we do become a piece of evidence if our remains are involved in a homicide. And her body, to say the very least, Barbara's body was rife with evidence. And I think that that's probably the centerpiece of the entire case. And then, of course, we have the various evidence that it's an evidence-rich environment also within the vehicle. As far as there was some compelling evidence that was put forth relative to the glass fracturing that was going on, what the source of that might have been, what the causality might have been. And these are kind of highly technical constructs for a lot of average everyday people to try to get their head around. How do we examine glass fragments and that sort of thing? And that's a big tell here, because as we well know, what the accused is claiming is that a pipe actually came through the window and resulted in all of these injuries, this myriad of injuries that Barbara has sustained to her remains. And so, for me, everything starts with the body, though.
You're right. I mean, she suffered broken nose, interior lip bruises, crushed cartilage in her throat, fractured skull, and 3 bone-deep gashes on the back of her head. Joseph, correct me if I'm wrong, is that really consistent with a pipe coming through a windshield, or does this seem something else?
No, Jesse, as we've talked before, my background, I worked for the coroner in New Orleans and for the medical examiner in Atlanta for many years, and I worked several cases of what we refer to as impalements. That is where we have a pipe that will enter a car and kill someone. Generally, it's kind of a one-off event. It's very straightforward. The injury or the impact injury itself is very exacting. And in this case, she has got a myriad of injuries. I think probably one of the biggest tells here is that if our audience could just place their hand on the back of their head, there's a little bump on the back of your head. It's called the occiput region. It's this little knot.
I'm doing it right now. Okay, I feel it. I feel it.
On the right aspect of it, your right hand, there are 2 lacerations. Lacerations are not generated by a slice. They're generated by impact like this. So she's got 2 that are right here running diagonally across the occiput, and then on the left aspect of the occiput, there's another one. What the medical examiner says in her report is that these are full thickness lacerations. What that means, particularly the 2 on the right, what that means is that these are 2 individual lacerated areas that go all the way, in vernacular, they go all the way to the bone. So if you could view this, you could actually see the external table of her skull looking through these. And these are 2 individual strikes. And then you've got a third over here. Now, you mentioned skull fracture. She's got a skull fracture. It's also noted that she's got what are commonly referred to as like raccoon eyes. Mm-hmm. Both eyes are black, essentially. What that means is that she has got a basal skull fracture. That means the floor of the skull is kind of cracked open like this, where our brainstem turns into our spinal cord. to put it in layman's terms, and tracks down that bone, the floor of the skull is very thin right there, and it actually fractured. This is not commonly something you would see with a forward impact where she's being struck like this, her head's being thrown back, and you would kind of have a target area. This is an insult that took place posteriorly meaning behind as opposed to anteriorly. And you'll see these two terms referenced over and over again in autopsy records.
So in your opinion, you believe, or at least it seems plausible for the jury to seem to understand, that something else might have happened here, in the sense that it's just too simple to say that a pipe went through the windshield. And let's just talk about this for a second. We saw some testimony about the idea of a pipe flying through the windshield at a certain speed, and I know it's dependent upon how fast the cars were traveling and the direction they were traveling. Does it make sense to you that a pipe would have fell off of a flatbed truck and pierced the windshield at that kind of speed and hit her? Is that something that is possible that might have happened?
No, I mean, when you're talking about piercing a windshield, I think most people think of this idea of a spear, all right? If you can, kind of put your mind in that gear where a spear is passing through. If I remember correctly, I think that the accused said that he pulled the pipe out of the windshield. And maybe I'm wrong. I think that's
he said he lunged forward, and that tried to explain why he had some lacerations on his hand, and he reached forward, he tried to get her out of the car, he performed CPR. That was actually my follow-up question, in the sense that story where he tried to lunge forward to help her, I felt that might have been inconsistent too, and that might have been something for the jury to jump on.
Yeah, I got to see the injuries on the back of his hand, and I have to say, Jesse, they don't necessarily appear consistent with that kind of, because let's think about it. If you're lunging forward or you're lunging over to block something, generally the palmar aspect of our hand, okay, is going to be in this position. He's got contused areas on his hand running along the knuckle. So if you think about catching a pass in football, it's kind of like this. The insults on the back of his hands are right here, and they run along the ridge line of the knuckles, right along here. It's very consistent with this, okay, as opposed to being blocked. There would be, if you've seen the image of this pipe, which I have on magnification, it's got a very distinct pattern. There's kind of a nut, a large-looking nut, even though it's not free floating. And it's also threaded. This would leave behind a very distinctive pattern. And keep in mind, in forensics, Jesse, that's one of the things that we look for, this connectivity between objects and insults or injuries, this connectivity between pattern injuries. And it's just not there.
Joseph, let's talk a little bit about the DNA and blood. That came into evidence on Friday. What did you make of that testimony? Because certain blood and DNA was found in certain areas, and it wasn't found in other areas. What did you make of that?
Yeah, it was kind of inconclusive to a certain degree. Well, it's kind of inclusive relative to she and he. I think that they put those numbers in the quadrillions, if I'm not mistaken, the odds that it would be anybody but them. And so that in and of itself was rather compelling. I didn't see anything that would give me pause to think that it was anybody outside of that familial group. Also, this is the upside, and one of the tools that we use, it's kind of a process of elimination relative to DNA. You have an expectation, if you're in a familial environment like husband and wife, where their DNA are obviously going to be present anyway. We have to think about source DNA, whether they're talking about touch DNA, which is like slough skin, or if we're talking about an origin DNA, like, say, for instance, blood, a body fluid, this sort of thing. There was some blood that was found there, but nothing gave us any kind of indication that it was anything other than their blood or a mixture of their blood. Right,
and just to break it down, they said there was blood on the seatbelt, the front of her seat, and on the passenger side floor mat. They couldn't find any blood on the pipe recovered at the scene, and a test done on one end of the pipe was negative for blood. Barb's DNA is on both ends of the pipe. An initial test on the pipe revealed a possible presence of blood, but again, analysts performed additional tests and couldn't find it. So again, what do you make of that?
Well, I have to say she came in contact with the pipe in some manner. Now, was she in the car traveling with the pipe? Possibly. Was it used as a weapon? I don't know that this large piece of pipe could necessarily be tied back as a weapon.
Right, because if it did hit her, she maybe moved it or she was flailing, and it makes sense that her DNA would be on it. But yeah, the presence of blood in certain places and the lack of blood other places, isn't that just an accident, or is it something else?
I don't know what all could be implied by that. I think that we have to give careful consideration to the contact area in which they were transporting, or this pipe was transported, either vis-a-vis the windshield,
right?
Okay, or vis-a-vis interiorly of the vehicle, and her being in contact with it already. Was she already bleeding when she was placed into the vehicle, or when she got into the vehicle, or was the blood source as a result of injuries she sustained while in the vehicle?
Joseph, stand by. I want to play a quick clip from the medical examiner in this case, and when we come back, I have a lot more to talk to you about the glass particles and some about Todd Kendhammer's DNA, because again, in this case, it seems to have more questions than answers, and hopefully you can provide a little bit more clarity to us. But in the meantime, here's some of the medical examiner's testimony from the other day.
About how many impacts do you think would have caused these 3 lacerations?
I think it's likely that there were at least 2, if not 3 impacts here. Because this site is somewhat separate from these 2 clustered, I can't say definitively if this represented one, injury against an uneven object, but I do feel there are at least likely 2 injuries or 2 impacts here.
Would the end of a pipe traveling with force cause all of these lacerations?
Well, I'll sustain the objection the way it's phrased.
Are you familiar, when you did your autopsy, you said you reviewed the accident report?
There was a brief 2-page document, I believe, yes.
And so you're familiar with the facts as they were given by Mr. Kendhammer?
Yes.
And was there anything about these injuries that concerned you related to the version of events told by Mr. Kendhammer?
Object to the formal question. Sustained, just sustained.
Was there anything concerning about these injuries to you?
Object to the formal question. Sustained.
When you looked at these injuries, do you think they came from a pipe?
I do not believe that these injuries are consistent with the end of a pipe striking the back of the head, no.
And why do you have that opinion?
Because I don't see any evidence of a curvilinear mark from the end of a pipe. I also think that if a pipe was traveling with great force and struck the back of the head, if you're going to say that these were all from the pipe, then it would have to be traveling sort of tangentially across the back of the head, and I believe that in that situation, it would actually avulse the tissue because the intense energy of the pipe traveling at that speed into the back of the head would cause worse damage than just these few lacerations.
What do you mean by avulse the tissue?
Meaning that it would quite likely tear the tissue off the scalp as opposed to cause 3 separate lacerations.
Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. Thanks for joining us. Again, so we are showing you clips from the Todd Kendhammer case previous testimony. I'm here with death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, one of the issues also is Barbara's neck. Okay, that was a big issue about what she suffered, the injuries to her neck. What did you make of that?
Well, it's telling. I think she's if folks at home will kind of palpate this area of their neck right here. We have the trachea, this firm area in the center of the neck. She's got hemorrhage that runs along both sides of this in the soft tissue. It's not necessarily consistent with, say, for instance, what we would think of as a strike. There's not like a bullseye, if you will, where something has specifically struck her. it involves two distinct areas. Many times we see this in cases where people are using a C-clamp on an individual like this, this area here. And there's also posteriorly, again to the rear, there's no fracturing of the neck itself. So the soft tissue in here has been hemorrhaged or has been clamped upon and has created hemorrhage into the soft tissues of the muscle in this area. This implies that a specific attention was given to this area relative to the trauma that was induced. It's not as if she was struck by a pipe in this area, because still you have to account for this area back here, and also she's got a myriad of other injuries that run up and down both anterior and posteriorly on her body as well, that are kind of hard to account for with a single strike from a pipe.
So in other words, it's possible that this prosecution's theory that she was strangled might make sense based upon her injuries.
Yeah, I'd say that it's plausible. It's something that should be taken into consideration. I think that, pardon me, I think that obviously going back to the head injury itself, that's the coup de grace. That's the most lethal area that she has back here. Now, whether or not she was struggling, which I think that we've got good indication of that because we've got broken fingernails, this sort of thing, which is generally an indication that an individual is in a fight for their life, fingernails scratching, that sort of thing. I think that, yeah, it's plausible that she could have been choked.
Let's talk about the staging, okay, this possible staging of this car accident. So in other words, if we believe what the prosecution's saying, it's possible Todd killed his wife and then it would have to place her in that area and then have the pipe come through the windshield, staging this car accident. There was an issue with the glass, and they said that they found glass on the passenger side seat, which indicates that no one was sitting at it at the time the glass was deposited, and then a lack of glass in the mat pocket in the passenger side door led to the conclusion that the door was open at the time. Try to break that down for our audience, what that means.
Yeah, obviously, if you have an object that is occupying a space, it will not allow, say, glass fragments, which are very, very tiny, they're referred to as shards, to wind up in the fabric. In that case, we did, or they did. Also in the pocket, the side pocket, the mat pocket, there was an absence of glass. I think that one of the things that I would be very curious to know about relative to the prosecution, how well did the police do their job at the scene in searching the rest of the vehicle to see if there's any kind of trace evidence, say for instance, in the trunk or in the back seat of this vehicle. And because I think that that's a way that we'll be able to, that is something that the defense is going to probe a bit when they get their own experts on there, and when they're asking the jury to take all of this into consideration, how thorough, if he's painting, if they're painting a picture, the police that is, that she was killed somewhere else, placed in the vehicle and transported to that location. You know, I think that we've even got an eyewitness that claims that they drove by and saw that windshield was intact when they drove by, if I'm not mistaken. And it was only sometime later that, you know, when the police arrived, that there was that the thing was broken.
Well, isn't that a question about when that windshield was broken? Weren't they able to analyze maybe there was an impact before the pipe went through the windshield?
Yeah, and that's another big question also, is where did the impact take place? I've actually read or saw part of the testimony that stated that I believe that the examiner felt as though that one of the impacts took place from the interior of the car and then another one from the exterior. So that also throws another wrench into this whole mix. It makes it very, very complicated.
Right, and Todd's DNA wasn't it found on the inside of the windshield as well as the outside of the windshield, which again would indicate that why would his DNA be on both sides, you know, unless he was trying to stage it. But then again, isn't this his car? Wouldn't his DNA be everywhere? Or am I just not thinking of it the right way?
Again, you have to think about source DNA. Is this going to be, again, what we've talked about in the past, Jesse? Is it touch DNA, or is it DNA that is collected as a result of blood? The blood evidence in and of itself is going to be critical in this case. We're talking about things like blood spatter and blood distribution and that sort of thing.
So we know that the prosecution is going to be resting their case soon. What does the defense need to do with their experts? I think they might be calling 40 witnesses. How many of those might be experts? And, how many of them, what would they need to do to convince this jury that this was an accident? What kind of evidence would they need to show about this crime scene? And I say crime scene because they don't want it to be a crime scene.
Yeah, they don't want it to be a crime scene. I got to tell you, Jesse, just based on, I don't know where they're going to go with this. That's as just a fan of true crime and trial crime and trial TV. I have to tell you, I'm sitting back just wondering where this is going to go, because when you look at her injuries, Jesse, it's almost as if she would have had to have been in a vehicle that overturned several times in order to generate this myriad of injuries that she had. And you just cannot get past this idea of the absence or the presence of the glass in the seat. That's telling. What he's saying is this is what the defendant is saying is that this is a one-off event. This single strike accounts for everything that we see before us. And it's going to be very, very hard for the jury to buy that. I think the prosecution up to this point has done a fantastic job with kind of painting the picture that they did relative to the physical evidence that they have thus far.
I guess at the very minimum, they need to have some sort of glass expert come on, talk about the fact of the glass spatters causes some gashes, some sort of bruises. But again, we're talking about serious injuries here that might not be consistent with a pipe.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They'll have to have a glass expert, which are not easy to find. In addition to that, they're also going to have their own forensic pathologist that's going to come to the stand and be able to counter everything that the medical examiner has said, which, if just looking at her report is, I look at a lot of autopsy reports from my appearances and whatnot. This is actually one of the most thorough ones I've seen in a long time. She did a fantastic job relative to this, documented every jot and tittle, if you will. A lot of the evidence that's here is absolutely overwhelming. I think to kind of leave it with this, I think that the abrasions that this woman has on her hands bilaterally, and also not just the dorsum, which is the back side of her hands, but also on her palm. I think that's a big piece to overcome. How do you account for having injuries here and having injuries there? And that in and of itself gives us an indication as to what hill the defense has to climb relative to evidence.
You just took the words right out of my mouth. You were basically painting the picture that they do have an uphill battle trying to show that this was, in fact, an accident. And again, that's really why this case was brought back to attention. This is why charges were filed against him. He could easily say it was an accident, but they believed something was there. They believed that something was sinister. Her injuries are not consistent with a pipe. I want to play a little bit more testimony from the other day, and we'll do more analysis as we wait for a live feed in the courtroom. But here is some testimony from the other day.
Exhibit 135, can you describe what we see in that photograph?
Exhibit 135 is an overall view of the exterior of the windshield. Our viewpoint is from the front end of the vehicle looking directly at the windshield from the front.
When you're taking these photographs and doing your examination, what types of things are you looking for?
Well, I want to get a general overall feel for what's present in these photographs. So this one is a general overall photograph of the front windshield in its entirety.
Right in the middle of the screen, there appears to be one place of impact. Can you describe where that is in relation to the rear view mirror?
Yes, you can see this windshield is fractured. The one that you're referring to is this pattern here, and it is directly in front of and behind the rearview mirror.
And there's on the other impact pattern, there's a perforation. Did you measure that?
I did.
And what were the measurements of that hole?
Well, a general measurement, it measured at 1 1/4 by 1 3/4 inches.
Did you also measure the pipe?
I did.
And what was the diameter of that?
The diameter of the pipe was,
It's in exhibit number 91.
yes, the diameter of the pipe itself was 1 1/2 inches in diameter. And there also was a
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. This is Jesse Weber. I just want to give you a brief update on what's going on in the Todd Kendhammer case. The defense tried for a motion for a directed verdict, basically trying to end this case, and the judge denied it. Let's now go to the live feed in the Todd Kendhammer courtroom. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. Again, this is Jesse Weber. You're watching a live feed in the Todd Kendhammer case. As I said real quickly, the defense tried for a motion for directed verdict, basically saying to the jury that to the judge that no reasonable jury could find in favor of the prosecution, and the judge denied that motion. I'm here today with death investigator, Joseph Scott Morgan from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, again, so basically in a legal framework, the defense said that the state has absolutely nothing and they should resolve this case, dismiss it, and the judge said no. Defense, it's going to be time to put on your case. Obviously, from what we talked about today, if you could just reiterate, what are some of the big questions that the defense is going to need to answer?
It all comes back to connectivity, Jesse, between how do they get past this web that has been created by the prosecution relative to all of the physical evidence. It's very, very difficult. The myriad of evidence that this woman has sustained, how do they cut through all of that? As far as the significant head injuries that she has sustained, injuries to her neck that may or may not be consistent with, say, for instance, a throttling. Also, how do you get past the defensive injuries that she, or what would commonly be referred to as defensive injuries, with the broken fingernails, abrasions, contusions on both the back sides of her hands and the palms. And then again, this glass evidence that we have involved inside of the vehicle and external of the vehicle as well. I think that this is a huge mountain to climb from a physical evidence standpoint, and it's going to be very interesting to see how the defense is able to armor up and try to cut the legs out from underneath this case, this huge case that the prosecution has already put forward.
Answer me this, Joseph. Would any of her injuries be consistent with him trying to get her out of the car, drag her out of the car, do CPR on her? Would any of those injuries that she sustained be consistent with that part of his story?
Well, not that I'm necessarily seeing, and let me kind of bracket that by saying that with CPR is generally the biggest thing that's going to be trauma-inducing for most people, particularly if you don't know how to do it. One of the things that we'll see in CPR attempts is sometimes you'll even have a sternal fracture, the large bone that's in the center of our chest right here, where people are doing compressions on the chest. That'll be fractured. We don't see that as well. And sometimes, and this generally goes to EMTs when they try to use shock paddles, we'll see kind of burned, abraded areas there. Of course, that doesn't exist. As far as extricating her from the vehicle, there's really nothing that would have prevented her from being extricated once the so-called pipe was removed and was found, I think, approximately 10 feet behind the vehicle. You know, maybe some drag marks, some abraded areas that you would see, say, for instance, if someone was pulling them by the arms and or beneath the armpits and dragging them to the rear, but nothing significant, nothing substantial like we're seeing in the case with this one.
Right, we're talking about a broken nose, interior lip bruises, crushed cartilage in her throat, fractured skull, and 3 bone-deep gashes on the back of her head. Again, yeah, not really that consistent. And we saw that interrogation tape of him, and he seemed to be kind of vague on certain parts of her injuries and didn't know how certain things could happen. And, you know, if you just blame it on a pipe, it might not work so well. What we're seeing right now for the live courtroom feed is the state is actually marking and checking all their exhibits before they bring the jury in. So we are just analyzing some of the key aspects in this case. Joseph, you got to explain something to me. I think I'm a little confused about this one item in the car. Maybe you could help explain it. There was a mug, okay? There was a mug in this car. And you keep seeing a lot of back and forth about the questions of this mug and whether or not it contributed to her injuries. What do you think about this mug?
I think that it's certainly something to put forward if you're conducting a defense. You know, how could a mug create an injury in a motor vehicle accident? Generally, as I've already spoken to this point already, you would have to facilitate injuries as a result of a free-floating object with weight inside of a vehicle. Almost imagine if you're in a tumble dryer with lots of firm objects. That's the way a rollover type of event happens. And essentially it could have generated. The only other thing I could think of is if somebody took a mug and beat someone with it. But save those 2 points, I don't see how the mug could have contributed to her injuries.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what they tried to do on cross-examination for some of these witnesses, it said, you know, you can find this DNA in the car, you can find that they had certain items in the car. They were a married couple. You know, it's not like you're investigating a crime scene where you're trying to understand who was at this scene and why. They're a married couple. Their different items of theirs, their DNA, it's going to be all over the car. And you have to, it's going to be hard for, I think, investigators to determine what DNA was a result of maybe the accident and what DNA was just as a result of being in the car. How much when you have a car like that, or even, you know, you have that kind of vehicle, how much gets washed away from rain? I know there was talk about rain, it raining on the car at one point, but how much DNA actually stays in a car at a given point?
Well, within the car is kind of a good containment area. We can harvest DNA from any number of places within a vehicle. Just in general terms, you have to think about where we place our hands many times inside of the vehicle. That's going to be the primary area of contacts, say the door handles, even the dashboard if you're supporting yourself, the steering wheel, all those sorts of things. And lots of times that DNA will hang around. Even if you get into a car and you're bleeding, that, you know, and say you get into the car and you've got a bloody nose and you touch your nose and you contact an area, you're still going to leave that DNA behind. The exterior of the car is a completely different story. If it's exposed to rain, all of the elements, that DNA will be compromised to a great degree. And if you find any at all, the rest of it will be so degraded it won't be usable. But most of the time, you know, just driving up and down the road, rain showers, that sort of thing, even heat can do away with external DNA like that.
Yeah, and just for our viewers, just so they understand from us, break it down really simple. What kind of evidence would be put forward by the defense here? We're expecting it today. What really would be key to show evidence or signs of an accident? Really, no signs of a struggle, no signs of wrongdoing. What would be a key point for them to introduce here today?
I think that probably, I would suspect that they're going to have somebody that's going to come in that has a background in forensic pathology, that is going to specialize in rapid deceleration events. motor vehicle occurrences. There are individuals out there that do specialize, and they're going to try to introduce this idea: what's the plausibility that someone could have sustained these types of injuries in a rapid decelerated event, and possibly even coming in contact with something that is accelerating toward them. So you're throwing on the brakes, maybe suddenly, and somebody's slamming forward. You've got an object that is coming toward you. And there are people that are going to specialize in this. And they're going to have to be able to explain in this dynamic environment how these injuries could have occurred on this woman's body, not just anteriorly on the front side, but also posteriorly. How did all of these things, and they're going to try to wrap all of this up. There's not that much on her body that is healing, Jesse. All of these injuries are fresh.
Right.
So that's a huge mountain, again, to climb. I don't want to wear that term out, but that's what this defense expert is going to have to overcome.
Fresh injuries. They really pinpointed that last week in the testimony, that this wasn't injuries that she had really before she went in that car. This is because of this accident. In terms of this other car, this flatbed truck that had the pipe on it, is there other ways that the defense could point out, I'm not an expert here, but any ways they can investigate the crime scene and say, look, we know a car passed this area at this point, maybe tire marks, maybe some sort of way, I don't know, some sort of debris coming off the car. Any way you can investigate that crime scene to determine that because we really didn't have any surveillance footage of this truck. Is there any ways to determine that, okay, a truck really came by at this time?
Yeah, unless you had CCTV footage, which I know that they've been hunting for, or they had been hunting for a period of time, or an eyewitness. And say the fact that, say, for instance, you had somebody that were to apply brakes on a vehicle traveling at a specific rate, and you leave those marks behind, there's not that much that you can do to dispel this idea of this truck, this flatbed truck. And being a flatbed truck, it would imply it's very distinctive. You're going to be thinking that there's dual tires on the rear. If there's skid marks, these things are going to be very, very distinctive in the roadway.
Yeah, good point. Joseph Scott Morgan, death investigator from Jacksonville State University, really making some great points today. I think we actually do have a live feed in the Todd Kendhammer case.